Okay, so Andy is the director of the Energy District here in Winship County, and I don't know. Andy, give yourself your own intro, I guess. You can make it short as you want. I don't know if I'll go embarrass you if I talk about you too long.
No, that's fine. I think most of us on the calls know relatively who we are. I've been with the Energy District, with Winship Energy District for 10 years. We all got started with this about 2010, and it's been quite a ride. We have been increasingly involved over the years in policy, jumping into the utility board dockets as far back as 2013 with energy efficiency and distributed generation after that. We're working on that, of course, right now, and we'll be talking about that today. But it's been a great experience to work with the Winship Energy District, and then as Joel mentioned, to have the Energy District movement growing since about 2015. Especially since 2017. We're now at about 9. We are at 9 incorporated energy districts in Eastern Iowa, and including now energy districts are spreading into Wisconsin. So we may touch more on that movement growth again a little bit later, but Kerri Johannsen, happy to have you here from Iowa Environmental Council, is their energy program lead, and is involved in a great deal of Iowa clean energy policy work, along with Steve Falck from the Environmental Law and Policy Center. These two organizations work very closely together and are oftentimes the lead in clean energy policy work, both at the Iowa Utilities Board and at the legislature. And we are happy to work very closely with them on many of these issues. So thanks both for joining us.
So do you want me to start, Andy?
You ready, Joel?
Yeah, okay. Yes, so Steve is going to start us off. I think that we're going to talk, we started the big picture. We're going to work on talking about some federal issues and then proceed down to state. And then Andy might pick up on some local opportunities as well. This is meant to be a panel, so I know that you guys are kind of in charge of your own little category, but this is meant to be a conversation between the three of you. So Steve, do you want to start us off first with,
Sure.
There was an issue that on the federal level before the Falck, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that was looking at basically redefining the authority of who gets to decide what net metering is. Right now that's on a state-by-state level. Give us some background on what that potential threat was and then how it's been resolved.
Sure, be happy to. And I want to thank you, Joel and Andy. And I'm sorry I'm not able to be up there in Winship County. I always enjoy driving up to Winship County. It's such a beautiful area, and my home area is in southern Fayette County. So it always gives me an excuse to actually get out of this bubble I'm in Polk County and get out to the countryside where real people live. So I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in person, but glad to join you on this platform. So as Joel said, Falck got a petition back in April 14th, 2020. The New England Ratepayers Association filed a petition for a declaratory order requesting that the commission, one, declare that there is an exclusive federal jurisdiction over wholesale energy sales from generation sources located on the customer side of the retail meter. So that would be all the distributed energy generation around the country. It would supersede anything that the state regulators or the state legislature may already have in place. And number two, order that the rates for such sales be priced in accordance with FERPA, which would have made it down around the wholesale rate. So and that's really the two things that NERA, the New England Ratepayers Association, wanted FERC to pick up and rule on. Well, who is NERA? Let's start there. NERA was it was filed as a nonprofit that said that they were an advocacy group seeking to protect families and businesses from excessive utility rates. So they saw themselves as an advocacy group. But one of the problems with this was that, and this was mentioned in many of the comments, that they misrepresented themselves because there were only 10 unnamed members contributing $20,000 each and giving giving $5,000. So 90% of it, 92% of its funding were from these groups that were unnamed. So these were kind of, it's been described as a shadowy group because there was no name who is behind this. So this was more of a trade group and not really an advocacy group representing families and businesses. So that was how NERA came about, and the ruling then was declared July 16th, 2020. So it was just recently, and the pretty much what FERC did, which we really were hoping for, that they just dismissed the petition outright. It was a unanimous decision. Chatterjee and Glick were in the majority, and then McNamee and Danley concurred. But both McNamee and Danley both said that the petition should be dismissed on procedural grounds, which some believe leave open an opportunity to address the substance in a future ruling. So we need to still keep an eye on this group or any other group that could try to go to FERC again and asking for another petition. And it was kind of suspect that this petition came out on April 14th, which was right at the very beginning when everybody was dealing with the pandemic. So it was, I think, done on purpose this way, the timing, but the amount of feedback from around the country, there are approximately 2.3 million net metering participants in all 49 states, well, in 49 of the 50 states. And there were, thousands of comments and groups representing thousands and thousands of people. In Iowa, we were, our EF table really kicked into high gear. We had some of our partners on the table connected with the governor's office, and Governor Reynolds did respond. She was the only governor in the country to weigh in that was a Republican. There was one other governor that weighed in, but she was a Democrat. So there were only two governors that weighed in, but there were a number of countless policy makers from around the country, as well as groups and organizations. So it was overwhelmingly asking FERC to dismiss the petition. And that's, in the end, that's what happened. And that was, again, just recently on July 16th. So if there are no other questions, I'll open it up for questions now about that ruling or what was or was not said.
Yeah, to all our participants, if you want to ask questions, I think anywhere throughout this, submitting a question via the comments is the best way to do that. And I'd be happy to make sure to read those off to our panel to get answers back to you. Kerri or Andy, do you want to weigh in on the FERC issue? No. We're glad it ended how it did. So
yes, we were very pleased. That would have been what we just had happened in March with the governor signing the new Sunrise bill. That would have then meant that bill would not have would have been moot. So we're very happy that we can proceed then with the Sunrise bill. I'll move on then to what is kind of going on at the federal level with this next stimulus bill that looks like it's being put together. So many of you probably know that the U.S. House had released the next stimulus package. It was has many different components to it, but the clean energy components to their bill, and I'm just going to give a brief summary. They would have appropriated $70 billion to transform the grid modernization. There was provisions for that $70 billion. There was also all of the renewable energy tax credits and tax incentives for wind and solar would have been extended. I haven't read the actual language to know how they were going to extend it, if they were just delaying the phase out, or if it was just, completely just lifting the phase out. But we are advocating right now, we're putting together a letter that's going to Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst to delay the phase down of the ITC for solar. And that letter is being circulated right now, looking for signatures. Another part of the U.S. House's plan talked about EVs, which would be zero emission cars, vans, and buses through more tax credits, supporting the manufacturing and the deployment of the electric vehicle infrastructure. And then the final point or part of that plan was going to be putting more resources into energy efficiency, which we know that that's, we had before been advocating at the federal level to address and do some pilot programs that the energy districts could participate in. So we're going to continue those efforts at the federal level to try to get some language in that would be something that energy districts could access. But that was the part of the U.S. Representatives, House of Representatives, their plan. Now the Senate is a different, they're not as, before, anytime that the House has tried to do anything around renewable energy, senators were saying, oh, it's the new Green Deal. And they were trying to frame it as the new Green Deal. And we're really hesitant to do anything for renewable energy. And thus far, that's pretty much how that's been playing out. But we do think that the Senate may pick up on some energy pieces. We're not sure exactly, the big focus on what the Senate is doing has to do with what they're going to do with unemployment insurance and keeping those resources going, as well as some more, perhaps something more cash payments to individuals. And that's taken up most of the talk, but the Senate wants to get something moving before they go on their August recess. And that August recess starts August 7th. So there isn't a lot of time to put together any kind of a meaningful package. And they want to get something done. So we need to move quickly with our comments in our letter to Ernst and Grassley about being a leader in promoting the solar ITC and delaying that phase down. So I will stop there with that piece on the federal issue. Unless there are any other questions, we can then move on to Kerri Johannsen.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say as a follow-up to everybody listening, we have an article that we probably will link to in our upcoming monthly newsletter, just explaining the phase down of both the solar tax credits, and then a new article that will go out this month, talking a little bit about the energy efficiency tax credits, which still are around. They're only a $500 credit, but something to look into, as well as the geothermal tax credits, which are phasing down on the same schedule as solar. So look for our newsletter for that. I just got a question here from Jacob. Can you explain the Sunrise bill? I think, Kerri, that's a great lead in to you. I think what we're talking about there is the solar net metering piece. So maybe you could start with that, talk about how that passed out of this legislative season. It's crazy to think that it happened this year before the shutdown. It really turns out that that was a really good thing that happened early in the session and wasn't waiting till the end. And the rulemaking process around that is just getting underway now at the Utilities Board, as the utilities try to offer a new rate structure for solar customers that meets the spirit and letter of that law.
Yeah.
Jump in
Thanks,
really
Joel. Yeah,
quickly.
go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, just really quickly. I'm not sure, Joel, if you mentioned up front, but to all the listeners, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat.
Absolutely.
We won't be unmuting at least till maybe at the end, depending on time. So please write those questions in the chat and Joel will pull them up for us. So sorry, go ahead, Kerri.
No problem. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sure you all remember in 2019 when we all worked together to fight the big battle against Mid-American's sunshine tax bill, which would have made it very hard for solar to pencil out for either of the investor-owned utilities, and added a bunch of fees and just been a really bad policy for customer-owned solar. Because we were able to defeat them in 2019, that brought Mid-American to the negotiating table, and we spent about 9 months hammering through a compromise policy that we were able to bring to the legislature in January, February. Sometime we finally got it all hammered out. And then it passed unanimously through both the House and the Senate, and the governor signed it. I think it was March 10th when she signed it, without a lot of fanfare, because at that point in time, everything was just starting to shut down, and the pandemic was really becoming a real thing here in Iowa. So yeah, like you mentioned, we were really lucky to get it in just under the wire. And then Joel, as you mentioned, the utilities on July 1st filed what's called a tariff, which is how it's their official policy that lays out how they are implementing the law. And so basically what the new policy does is, it's quite complicated, but I'm going to try to keep it relatively simple. It creates what is called an inflow-outflow tariff. So it's very, very similar to current net metering from a customer standpoint. The customer experience is going to be very similar. But whereas before, if you had solar panels, on the hottest summer day of the year, you would produce more than you need, and you would bank kilowatt hour credits that would then go to offset the kilowatt hours that you use in the winter or at night when you're not producing from your solar array. And that all nets out over time, and your meter spins backwards and forwards. This basically operates the same way, but instead of having a kilowatt hour credit, that credit is translated into whatever the retail rate for electricity is. So your credit on your bill will be in dollars and cents instead of a kilowatt hour credit. And that dollar and cents credit can offset, it can't offset your fixed charge. So if you're an IPL customer, I can't remember if they're at $12 a month now.
Something close to that. I think 13 is pretty well what it is now.
Yeah, 13. That part of your bill can't be offset. It's just the usage that you have in kilowatt hours can be offset with what you bank in dollars. And so that's how it looks from the customer standpoint. And then the purchases that the utility makes, or the credits that it issues for what is called the inflow is the energy that you actually end up purchasing from the utility that you need in excess of what you produce. And the outflow is the excess that you produce that is sold back to the utility and goes out to other customers to use. So anything the utility purchases through the outflow process, then they get to treat like other energy purchases, and they pass through, and those are paid for by other customers who are using the energy. So from the standpoint of a person who has the solar, it looks pretty much identical. And we think, and then it's this process lasts for either 7 years or until we hit a 5% penetration level for behind the meter distributed generation. And then at that point, we move to a full value of solar process, where we do the analysis of how much solar is worth, all the benefits, and that will be the outflow payment that you receive. However, if in this 7-year time span, you build solar 2 years from now, let's say, you get the applicable retail rate for the 20-year period. You're not going to switch to the value of solar rate when value of solar comes up. So
Right.
every year, so you know up front that the investment you're making, what the payback will be and what you're going to get. So yeah, so we I'm happy to try to answer more questions about that. We also have I know Andy, I think you did a blog post on this, if I'm not mistaken. We have one that's pretty straightforward as well that we can share too, that lays this out, so you can kind of read it a couple of times and
One
see how
question
it all
I have,
went down.
Kerri,
Yeah.
and maybe you could just clarify, this is the new proposed system that is going to replace our current, what they're calling net billing for solar customers. In the interim, you're still, if you were signing up for solar today, are you still under the current net billing? And that will go forward, and you'd be grandfathered in that system if you would like?
Yes, that's right. So the current tariffs will be in place. The current policy will be in place until the new one is approved.
Mm-hmm. And do we have any indication of what the time frame for that might be?
Yep. So the utilities filed it, like I said, on July 1st. For Mid-American's tariff, we had any objections to the tariff were due yesterday. We did file comments asking the utilities board to docket the tariff to deal with the renewable energy credit issue. But we think that Mid-Americans is probably more likely. Alliance had a lot more issues, shockingly. I know nobody on this call is surprised by that. And so there were a number of things that need to be fixed before we'd be comfortable with that becoming the new policy for Alliance. And so hopefully it won't drag on too long, but we think, it's better to get it right now than to hurry it into existence and then end up, with a policy that is bad. There's also, in both tariffs, even if you take service under the current tariff, you can switch away from it. So even if you do, you take the pilot, it's their pilot net billing tariff, you could do a solar array now, and then a few months from now when the new tariff is in effect, you can switch. You just can't switch back to an old version of it.
Right. Good to know.
You can't carry over any credits, though. People should know that. So if they have a built-up credit, you're going to need to use that, or you might not want to switch. So
yeah, you might want to wait until your annual cash out period, or if you're like us and you've been home all summer and you've been using every kilowatt hour that you've been producing, maybe you don't have that many credits built up. But yeah, that's something you'd want to do the math on, whether it makes sense to do that.
Great.
Because, one benefit for Alliant customers is going to be that, Alliant structured their tariff to really limit the system size a lot and limit the amount of credit you can get out of your system. And under the new law, it explicitly says you can net meter up to 110, or your system size can be up to 110% of your annual energy usage. And that is to account for things like, if you grow your load over time, if you get an EV, the system degrades over time. So we wanted to have a little bit of excess capacity up front that you could have. And so, if you installed a system under the old tariff that's smaller than what you actually need, under the new tariff, you should be able to expand that to do 110% of your load. So that's something that we think a lot of people will consider. But if we get it right in this tariff.
Great.
theoretically.
Well, hey, we've got one clarifying question here from Chris before we move on to the state tax credits. But this is from Chris Hoffman. It says, what is the rate paid to customers for outflow? Is it similar to the current avoided cost? And will it be for all rate classes or just residential? So just clarify again that the amount that is paid with this new, solar tariff. I can't, they're not, inflow outflow. With the inflow outflow solar tariff that is proposed, not in effect yet, but will be in effect, before the end of the year, certainly.
Yeah, so the rate paid will be it says the applicable retail rate for your class. So residential customers will get the residential kilowatt hour rate, commercial will be commercial, industrial, etc. It's that full kilowatt hour rate with all riders, anything that's charged by the kilowatt hour is part of the rate that you get. The avoided cost piece only comes into play if you oversize your system, if you have an overall system that's bigger than 1 megawatt, then anything over that 1 megawatt, you're only going to get avoided cost. But as long as you're under the 1 megawatt and you're net metering 110%, you get the full retail rate for the applicable customer class.
Yeah, so it looks very different from the accounting standpoint, but at least from the end customer, if you're sizing a system to meet 100% of your needs, there's going to be very little difference between the current net billing rate and this new inflow outflow rate.
Yep.
And though the trap is still there for large customers, so large general service customers that have demand charges, the demand charges cannot be offset essentially by your outflow rate. And that's the case, that's the way it has been. So that's not a new change. It's just still a challenge for demand bill customers. But for residential general service, it should be a pretty good net metering if, as Kerri says, we can actually get it implemented as the law intends, not just as Alliance submitted their tariff, which we're all working on. So,
Yep.
Okay. Well, we'll keep people up to date with that. Let's talk a little bit about the state tax credit, because that is an important thing. As the federal tax credit winds down, the state tax credit is set to match the federal tax credit, but we've ran into problem over the past years, just an increasingly amount of a waiting list for this credit. So Kerri, if you want to talk a little bit about that waiting list, why there's a waiting list, and some possible solutions that could help fix that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we were hoping that maybe we could get some more funding for the state tax credit into some sort of economic stimulus thinking when the legislature came back into session. That wasn't really where they were at the time, but we know that there are, the governor has working groups right now thinking about economic stimulus and recovery. And we are going to be working on this for the next legislative session. So the waiting list, at least at the end of session in June, exceeded, so we had a $7.6 million waiting list, which I had to double check and ask, is that really just the waiting list? There's a $5 million annual allocation to this. And so that 7.6 is on top of the $5 million.
So to put that in terms, if you were to put solar up now, you're going to you're not getting your tax credits this year. You're not getting them next year. You're getting them the year after that. 2022.
Yeah. Exactly. And every installation that goes in, we're just building on that waiting list. And so that's when you're trying to sell a system and people are looking for the tax credit benefit, and you say, well, you'll get it eventually, it makes it harder, especially for businesses, to plan, like, well, I don't I don't know what I'm going to need for tax 3 years from now. I need to know, I know what my tax liability is going to be for the coming year. So we think paying down that balance is a really important thing. You also mentioned that this is tied to the federal tax credit, and that the federal tax credit has already will begin stepping down this year, or did it already start stepping down?
Yep. Last 2019 was the full 30%, and this year it is 26%.
That's right. That's right. And so we would really like to see this decoupled from the federal tax credit. You know, we can't rely on the feds doing something to salvage the tax credit. And if that goes away, that would be a pretty significant hit. The way that works is that the residential tax credit eventually goes away entirely, and so the state tax credit also would be zero since it's 50% of the federal credit. The commercial solar credit continues on indefinitely at 10% of the project cost, and so then at that point the state tax credit would be 5%. So you would have an overall 15% credit for commercial systems still. But certainly, I mean, we've seen what this program has delivered in projects in all 99 counties, a giant amount of leverage in terms of investment. I think it's something like $7 of investment for every dollar that the state has put into the program. So obviously it has supported a lot of jobs and economic development. And so we would really like to see it continue on its own, regardless of what the federal government decides to do. And those were, it was decoupling, paying off the amount. And then, I mean, honestly, yeah, if we could get everything we wanted on top of that, really, I think what we're seeing is that $5 million is not an appropriate annual amount allocated to this credit going forward, given the demand that we've seen. So we'd really like to see $10 or $20 million a year dedicated to this credit. That could really boost the solar industry and give a lot more people the opportunity to use this credit.
Yeah. Okay. Kerri, and maybe Andy, you want to jump in here too a little bit, just explaining, gosh, I think this was from not this session, but from last session, some rules on taxing electric vehicles, as well as taxing the energy that is used to fill them up, and some proposed options for fixing that before parts of that law go into effect.
Yeah, Andy, do you want to walk through it?
Go ahead. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah, so the year before last, the legislature, not doing anything helpful for EVs, just decided that it was time to start taxing them, and put in place some annual fees on top of what the registration fees already paid by EV users. I know some of you on this meeting, Amy, I know we got one nice little postcard telling you to get ready for this additional charge that you were going to see every year. And the purpose, the idea behind it was, well, we're losing revenue, gas tax revenue, and EVs need to pay their fair share for fixing the roads. If you look at the data, you know, EVs today are already paying significantly more than your typical sedan on the road, and often more than, you know, the largest, you know, 4x4 trucks that are out there on the road as well. And so, you know, there's already a significant contribution. But, you know, we didn't push back too hard on that annual fee. The piece that we were very concerned about and that we still really feel needs to be rolled back is a kilowatt hour charge on the energy used to fill up at a public charging station, or a charging station that isn't located at somebody's house. And so that would be I'm trying to remember if I think it's 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour fee, which is pretty significant. It's like a 25% tax. And this applies across the board. So there's no there's no differentiation between like a level 1 or a level 3 charging station. So it doesn't matter if you're, if you're fueling up in 20 minutes at a Chatamo charger, or if you are, trickle charging from a wall outlet in a parking garage. There's supposedly no difference between the two. And it turns a lot of entities like employers that would have wanted to offer charging as kind of a perk, or a business that would want to put a charger outside and maybe have free charging for people to attract customers, turns them into basically a gas station where you have to submit a ton of paperwork to the Department of Revenue on a quarterly basis, with all of the information about how much electricity you sold. And that means either you have to put in a separate electric meter, so you have another monthly meter charge, or you have to put in a really high-tech charger that keeps track of the kilowatt hours in a different way than you normally would have. And so we've been concerned that what this will mean is a slowdown in deployment of charging infrastructure in Iowa, and could actually result in some charging infrastructure just going away, from folks who are like, I am not going to deal with that. I'd rather just not have a charger at all. Like, I think about our local library, which has free charging stations. Why would they go through everything it's going to take to get up to that law? And so one of the positive things is that piece of the law is not effective until 2023. And so there is time to try to roll that back. Last year, we had started some conversations with some businesses who were interested in trying to undo that piece of the legislation. But given that it was the same set of legislators who had just passed the law, it was very hard to convince them they had all done something wrong. And so people were looking at, it's going to be starting this next year. I would think that some hard pushes are going to start for a repeal and replace type push on that. And Andy, I know that you've been talking to some businesses who've had some concerns about workplace charging. So those are the kinds of things that we're really looking for, to try to build a coalition to say, this is a bureaucratic nightmare. It's not worth it. This isn't the way to do it. It's not good for the economy in Iowa to do it this way. So.
Yeah, as Kerri mentioned, the onerous parts of this bill are multiple. I mean, the extra registration fee is one thing, but the tax on charging is another. And one of the things that Joel and I have actually run a number of numbers on is trying to get at, how this really works, and is it really necessary for the gas tax replacement, and et cetera, et cetera. And really, there is a fundamental distinction I think we should be making with policymakers when we talk to our legislators between level 2 and level 3 charging. In other words, between the kind of lower voltage charging that you would do either in your garage or on Main Street or at the library or at the bank or at the pizza parlor, anywhere other than that at a dedicated filling station, convenience station, which are going to be really high, very expensive to install, high voltage supercharging. And so if you look at gas tax, for example, legislators might make the argument, well, look, we have all this through traffic in Iowa on the interstates coming back and forth. Well, first of all, is that state or federal needs for road maintenance? But what you're going to collect along the interstate is going to be from high voltage level 3 charging. Everything else in our communities and homes is going to be level 2. That would be an easy distinction for a law to make. If you really need to tax electrical fuel, you can tax it at level 3, but leave alone level 2, because those are going to be the thousands of charge stations all over our communities that are really going to enable the development of an EV transportation sector. And why go to all that administrative hassle and red tape for those level 2 systems? So that, I think, when we're talking to policymakers, that's a really important argument and distinction to make, and I think they'll get it. It's not that hard. So yeah, when we bring in the businesses, hopefully the business community, maybe the farm community, why don't the co-ops want to offer, charging? All kinds of farm needs are going to need that charging too. So hopefully that's a coalition we can continue to build and work on.
Yeah, I think, you know, as you're talking, Andy, I think about, you know, that absolutely is the common sense solution. Let's treat the gas station chargers like gas stations and not try to, you know, tax every little outlet across the state. You know, I think it's a common sense solution that hopefully we can build some support around. One of the issues with it is that, you know, there are some big interests that want all the charters to be treated the same, and they don't want to be singled out to be the ones that are getting taxed. But, you know, it's a policy problem, and so we're just gonna have to be creative in how we market this and how we bring people over to our side on it.
Yeah, I would just chime in. I would want to kind of talk it through too. The Volkswagen settlement just announced some of the most recent awards this week about who are getting some of the DC chargers. And Mid-America got a couple, and then Mid-America had about 8 that weren't awarded. But so did the truck, I-80 truck stop. They got money for a DC fast charger. So yeah, let's maybe talk it through more with our coalition to kind of see what makes sense moving forward on that distinction.
It's not that far off either from the distinctions already being made in the solar arena that we're all talking about. You know, net metering at the sort of full retail equivalent value of solar studies, you know, show that there are a lot of benefits there, including on the distribution grid. Well, when you move up to private developers in the many megawatt scale, and they're entering the transmission grid, and they do have transmission fees and other issues associated, they don't get the same net metering rate that the rest of us do. So those distinctions aren't really new in the clean energy world. But yeah, we need to talk through them and figure out exactly what a proposal might be.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Andy, you're going to talk some energy district stuff for a while. Give us an update on, this is our 10th anniversary that we're coming across here. And talk to us a little bit about how that's changed from being just one energy district to the number of partner energy districts we have now. And give us an update on CEDI, that's CEDI, Clean Energy Districts of Iowa.
Yeah, sure. And then also bring Steve back into the conversation, because our largest metro county in Iowa is in the process, hopefully, certainly thinking through how this would work in a metro county, which is obviously very different than Winneshiek, where we started, a very rural county here. The first energy district growth counties were Clayton County to our east and Howard County to our west. Once Dubuque joined at about that point, about a couple of years ago, we started working on the creation of an association, because there were more counties already in the process of talking to us about it. So the CEDI, Clean Energy Districts of Iowa, is an incorporated nonprofit organization, which is our association essentially. For Iowa, interestingly, we're already now starting to get essentially affiliate members outside of Iowa, but that's okay, because obviously, as our discussion here shows, so much of what energy districts do on the policy front, which isn't all we do, but on the policy front has to do with state policy. And that really does vary state by state. So as energy districts hopefully continue to grow in other states, ultimately we'll have different associations and we'll all work together on the federal level. But we have 9 currently clean energy districts in Iowa, and the latest couple include Johnson County and now Lynn County as well as an incorporated energy district. I'm just going to mention 3 areas of local policy, because CEDI, the association, has worked on a policy platform that includes most of what we've talked about today. Certainly at the state level, these are important policy items. But CEDI also ended up defining some policy priorities that were very relevant at the local level for all of our counties and local governments and cities. And we may not have time to dig too deeply into these, but I'm going to mention 3. If folks have questions, we might come back to them, but then I'm going to pass it right off to Steve to tell us a little bit about the happenings in Polk County as well. So 3 of the important policy opportunities that we really all have working locally, since we're all often so focused at the state or federal level, include locally owned solar. So as we talk about solar, this policy priority is talking about local publicly owned solar, so local government owned solar. So our cities and our schools and our counties could all own solar, and when they do, we all own that solar. So in a sense, even though Iowa doesn't have a statewide community solar program like Minnesota does, which should be another state priority maybe for us, if our city owns solar, every city resident is a solar owner. We're all gaining the benefit. A lot of the equity issues are actually very, very good. The same for school systems. And we're seeing a growing level of interest in schools among districts and cities and counties. But those opportunities really could roll and accelerate right now, even more quickly than they are, especially with the current tax credits still in effect. Because when the tax credits go away, the ability for third parties to take advantage of those and pass through some of those benefits also may go away. So local government owned solar is something that we all could be talking to our local officials about right now. Another one is local building codes. So Iowa has a state building code, and generally state building codes include an energy code, and Iowa's does as well, but it's old, and there have been attempts to even sort of gut it somewhat or neuter it somewhat. There are question marks about whether local building codes can be more stringent than state. But there are also municipalities, both in Iowa and elsewhere, that have said, we're just going to do it. It's not that generally most states aren't going to go after a small town that has a building code that might want to enforce an energy code that's a high quality energy code. So the point is, many of our local jurisdictions in rural Iowa haven't adopted the building code, which means they don't enforce it, which means there's no energy code enforced. Even though technically there is one in place through the state building code that should be in effect for all building in Iowa, all construction in Iowa. If there's no local enforcement, there's essentially no local building or energy code. And so much of what's being built today, both in the residential and commercial sectors, is not being built to a quality energy code. That's an opportunity that a lot of us have to work with our local officials. And then a third opportunity that I'll mention is called PACE. Now this is both local and state, but PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. You can do some Googling on that. And the basic idea is that if there is state authorization, it's not a state mandate, but if there is state authorization, then local governments, counties, and cities can essentially create a fund, can bond for a clean energy fund, allow local customers to participate either through private or public finance with energy efficiency and renewable energy projects on their buildings. This could be commercial or residential, but in many cases it's limited to commercial. And then wrap the costs of the payback there of that financing onto the property. In other words, so rather than a separate loan that you're making payments to through the bank, you're making payments on your clean energy project with your property tax assessment annually. One of the real strong benefits of that is transferability. So if you're a business owner and you're not sure if you're going to own your building for the next 10 or 20 years, long enough to recoup the benefits of an efficiency or solar investment, you could do a project like this, and the costs of that, the financing essentially gets tied to your property taxes, and it just passes to the next owner if you want to sell your business next year, your building. So in states that have adopted PACE programs, they have actually seen some very significant jumps in energy efficiency projects, and depending on how it's set up, renewables, especially among the business sector. This would take state authorization. So it's something that we would all need to work on at the state policy arena, but then it's something that would be implemented through local governments. It's really unique. It's just one more tool, but it's a tool that certainly many of our cities and counties could take advantage of if we had state collaboration. So that's just a brief overview of a few local policy options. There are more, but Steve, could you just go ahead and catch us up on how things are going in Polk County with your new energy?
Thanks, Andy. And I have to give a shout out to Kevin Sand because I took a meeting with him a couple years ago, and he said, he comes to Des Moines quite frequently to visit his son and grandkids, and he goes, why don't we start a Polk Clean Energy District? And so I gave some thought to it about how would that framework look like in an urban district. And so I want to thank Kevin for kind of being the one to give me a kick in the pants, really, to get something to think about it. So how we are structuring the PCED, which is Polk Clean Energy District, instead of doing
There he is.
the whole county as you would in a rural setting, doing the whole county, we're going to kind of go neighborhood by neighborhood. So we're going to put together some of the low to moderate income neighborhoods, some of the housing infrastructure that really needs this work first. They need it the most, and so we want them to be first. So we're going to knit together a couple of neighborhoods together, call that kind of a mini district where they would have their own board, because it really needs to be, they need that local ownership and get people on that board that reflects that neighborhood. And so that's kind of how we're going to start putting together and organizing. We're right now we're going and recruiting for temporary steering committee members to kind of get things moving with the bylaws and incorporation, articles of incorporation, and start raising some resources. We have been for the last several months doing kind of an inventory of groups in Des Moines that are already sort of in this space on old housing infrastructure and want to form some partnerships. So that's kind of where we're at. We're at the very beginnings yet, and things have kind of, with everything going on, we're switching over to a virtual platform instead of personal contacts, but we are moving forward. And I just would also want to say ELPC in Chicago is also interested in this framework, this model. And we've had several meetings with Andy. We're trying to be helpful with how can we find some resources. And also there's a group in Michigan that's interested in this type of work, as well as Southwest Wisconsin and Northeast Illinois that Andy's been a part of, Andy and Jolene. So just know that, yeah, EOPC as an organization has really embraced this model, and we want to do what we can to help promote either through federal legislation or other funding resources.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Well, I'm looking at the clock and seeing this 12:56. So if there's any last minute questions for any of our panelists, I think we probably have time for maybe just one. Other than that, I want to thank you all for joining us. Special thanks to Kerri and Steve for phoning in and joining the webinar. Thanks so much. And I think if we don't see anything coming through here, I'll just say, oh, go ahead, Andy. Andy wants the last word.
No, but I
No?
do see a question from Jolene about franchise agreements. So without going into too much detail with it happening in Decorah, though you can read about that on our blog roll, news roll on our website, quite a bit of challenges with franchise agreements in Decorah. But the basic lesson around franchise agreements for communities is they have significantly less import and importance, and you do not even need to have them in Iowa. But the main point is there are some benefits to signing a franchise agreement with your energy provider, whether it's gas or electric. The key is do not sign a long-term. Traditionally franchise agreements are 25 years. The utility locks the community into 25 years of service at these terms. Those terms preclude any efforts at municipalization, but also other potential actions a community might want to take. Increasingly, there are examples now, templates where utilities have been willing to sign at 5-year intervals. And so at the very least, do not sign a franchise agreement as a city for anything longer than 5 years ever. That's the takeaway that we're at right now. And we can talk more about that. Feel free to get in touch with us if you have questions about that.
I totally agree with you on that, Andy. Short term is better. The markets and energy is evolving fast. So you want to be a part of that evolution and the innovation that's happening out there. And a long-term agreement is going to just prevent you from being able to take advantage of that technology.
Yeah, excellent. Great. Thanks again for everyone for joining us. I'm just shooting a link here too. If you guys want to sign up for the Interdistricts newsletter, we send things out monthly as far as newsletter, and then occasionally, typically about once a month, we'll have an action alert in terms of if we think that there's a piece of information that you need to know about in terms of legislation or new information on solar policy or whatever. So thank you all, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Andy. Good to see everybody.
Thank
So
you.
long.
Everyone. All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yep.